Hello, welcome to the This Is Not a Watermelon podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Professor Refqa Abu Rameli, who is a professor of modern Arabic literature and film at the Free University in Berlin. That's F-R-E-I-E, not F-R-E-E. This episode is being recorded on March 20th at 4:15 p.m. in Palestine. And I'm absolutely excited to have Refqa on because she is behind an unbelievable project that I came across called Country of Words, a transnational atlas for Palestinian literature. It's online, and it is one of the most amazing things I've come across in years. So I'm thrilled to be welcoming you to the series. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mikey. Thank you for your kind words.
Yeah, it is a sort of a gigantic resource, and I'm amazed by it. Maybe let's just start with the title. Why discuss? Why publish something called Country of Words? And what does a transnational atlas for Palestinian literature mean?
Mm-hmm. Country of Words was inspired by one of Mahmoud Darwish's poems, where he talks about ours is a country of words. And that kind of struck a chord for me, that there is this body of words that exists all over the world almost, that brings Palestinian literature together, because Palestinian literature is a national literature, I would say, that is without a nation state. So it's this literature that is dispersed and scattered all over the world. And this is where the atlas comes into play, because I was trying to do this kind of mapping across the world of Palestinian literary production, Palestinian literary life, in different parts of the world, starting from the Arab world, but also going through Europe, North America, Latin America, and these are mainly the areas I was able to cover for this atlas. But the idea of the atlas was to maybe pave a path towards understanding where Palestinian literature existed, produced, disseminated, was discussed, where people were, what the networks were like in these various places, and what was being debated. So this is the kind of geo aspect of this project, is the atlas part, but it's really following the trajectory of modern Palestinian literature as a national literature without a nation state.
Yeah. Can we talk about a little bit of the origin story between about when you started working on Country of Words? How far back would I have had to met you before you would have had any inkling about the desire of creating this project?
Well, it was never exactly clear that this would be the outcome of the project, but mainly it's a project that was called PALREAD, that was funded by the European Research Council, and that began in 2018 and ended in 2023, so just last year. And this is one of the major outputs of that project. And this ERC project was a team-based project. This is important to highlight because a lot of this work would not have been possible without a team. So I was working with an amazing team of researchers based with me at the university, but also working with international researchers in different areas of the world, primarily in Lebanon, Palestine, Kuwait, and Egypt. And then also I worked with a researcher on Latin America and the Caribbean. So it was a big effort in which we really gathered a lot of this data on which this project rests. And it was during that time that I knew that I wanted to move in the digital direction. I was inspired by a lot of the projects that were coming out of Palestinian cultural initiatives and other initiatives that were digital, that were interactive. And I could see that this was kind of a direction that was taken, mainly because I think of the threat to Palestinian documents, to archives, to any collections, private libraries, anything of note really is under threat when it comes to Palestinian culture. And I can see why a lot of institutions and individuals decided to go the digital route. But for me, it was always also an experiment with digital humanities. How much can digital humanities allow us to do that we can't do as just an individual or as manual data collection? And I really wanted to experiment with the tools of digital humanities to create visual aspects to the project. And that was very important for me because I would usually do these visual diagrams for myself anyways. But when it came to this much data, the amount of data we gathered, it was not possible to just do this manually. So it was important to develop these tools for the project and make it this kind of digital interactive project. But I would say even before this, and now looking back, it all makes sense. But at the time, I didn't know that I was going in this direction. But there's quite a few things that led me in this direction, and they all came together in this project. One was this question of who writes Palestinian literature and where is Palestinian literature written, and by whom, and who gets to write that story, because this is a kind of an attention inside Palestinian literature. Who gets to write the story? And then this question of the fact that Palestinian literature is not your typical national literature. So it's not centralized in one location where all these literary figures and etc. lived in the same country, debated, wrote, etc., distributed, published. This was not the case. So how do we try to understand it? Because the usual way is to tack it onto the rest of Arabic literature, where we study Egyptian literature, Lebanese literature, etc. And then you have Palestinian literature added onto that. But that method just doesn't work because it doesn't allow you to see the bigger picture and to understand the scale, the transnational scale of this history. And so that's where I started thinking, okay, so what happens if we place the figure of the refugee or the exile at the center of this literature rather than the nation, let's say, the national figure at the center? And so does that open up the box, so to speak? Does that allow us to see more about this history? And so I was also experimenting with that. And then this concept of counterpoint that I came across through music, but also through Edward Said's work, where you have these, let's say, parallel strands of, let's say, in this case, it would be music and notation, but here we have multiple strands of what I called fragments, like narrative fragments that came together, overlapped, were harmonious at some points, were dissonant at other points. So how do we bring the fragments of Palestinian literature together and have this kind of interactive visual dimension to it at the same time to understand it better? Because otherwise, this was not going to be possible to write it in a conventional book form. It would be too linear and would not capture the essence of this kind of literature that I was trying to understand.
So let me just, for people who are listening to the podcast, let me just give them an idea of what I'm looking at. So I'm at countryofwords.supdigital.org, which stands for Stanford University Press Digital. And I'm looking at this amazing website that has at the top timeline, network, visualizations, and audio interviews. And the timeline spans from 1880 to 2020 at the top. And there are these sometimes overlapping phases. And I'd love to sort of go through a few of those periods before we get into some of the authors and writers and members of the network, of these different networks. So maybe we can start with the first phase, which is 1880 to 1950, which is Literary Diasporas, the Mahjar. Can you talk a little bit about why the bookends for this period, and why did we start there and sort of stop at 1940 and 1950, not 1948?
This Mahjar period, I mean, these dates are rough in the sense that I went by what I read was the first recorded presence of a Palestinian in Chile. It was around the 1880s. So that's why I decided to start it there. I mean, it's to kind of mark a bigger phenomenon of this migration from the Levant to North and South America, mainly to Latin America and the Caribbean. And the end of this period is 1915, mainly because in the entirety of this project, I focused on Arabic language publications, mainly newspapers and magazines that were published in the Arabic language, including in Latin America and other parts of the world. But by 1950, in Latin America and other countries, due to all sorts of dynamics in different countries, including the banning of foreign language publications in Brazil, for example, which affected not just the Arab community there, but the German and Italian communities, who were prolific publishers in their own languages of newspapers and magazines. But the 1950s marks the end, let's say, of Arabic language publication in these countries. I mean, obviously, there's other things that continue after that. But the other aspect of this is the loss of the Arabic language in these Mahjari communities, especially in Latin America and in North America. So they were no longer publishing in Arabic. So these were the kind of rough dates within which I placed this period. But the reason I wanted to start with it was because I see it as the first iteration of this diaspora and homeland continuum. So, I mean, my project, the PalRead project, was supposed to start in 1948, but I kept having to go back and back and back and further back to understand actually what got us to 1948 and the difference between pre and post 1948. And as in the process of going further back in time to understand what happened, the extent of the rupture, the extent of the tragedy, was to trace these kind of relationships between diaspora and homeland, exile and occupation, exile and colonial, being under colonial occupation. So I saw this as an opportunity to include this period, which usually is not included in Palestinian literary history.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. So I wanted to include it because for me, it was the first iteration of a relationship between the homeland and the diaspora, this kind of continuum, or what I call an extended literary geography, which takes us to Chile in this case. And I start to kind of bring it closer to Palestine in terms of the debates and discussions and networks and people.
Before we continue, I'm curious how the idea of Palestine sat in the literature in this period, specifically in the 19th century. How did people talk and write and publish about the notion of the nation of Palestine, even if there wasn't a state?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was, to my surprise, was a very vivid topic in a lot of these newspapers and magazines. And I'm primarily, so for the whole project, I only looked at newspapers and magazines, and I did not do a literary analysis of literary texts. So I was just following the debates, the people, the periodicals, these newspapers, and the debates within them. So that the only analysis I did was of the newspapers and magazines. But in these newspapers and magazines in North America and South America, in Chile and other countries, Palestine was a very hot topic. I mean, it was being discussed, it was being written about. And what struck me was that in some cases, when in Palestine, Palestinian newspapers and Palestinians could not publish due to censorship by the British, by the Israelis, by whatever, whichever occupation force was there, you would find more information looking at some of these Latin American and American newspapers, actually. So I mentioned an example there in 1920, there was the Nabi Musa uprising, and Palestinian newspapers under British repressive laws could not publish exactly what happened in that uprising. And the Chilean newspapers were already asking, we want to know what happened. We received newspapers from Palestine that were redacted by the British censor. And so, but in many of these cases, Palestine was being discussed because of the Balfour Declaration, because of the colonial occupation. So was Syria, so was Lebanon, so were others. But what's interesting about Palestine is that in 1925, the British citizenship law directly affects those Palestinians in the Mahjar. Suddenly they became stateless. And this is when they start to lobby and kind of develop a Palestinian identity, because their status was different than the Lebanese or the Syrians and others in the Mahjar. And before that, and for most of this period, actually, there's not much differentiation between Syrian, Palestinian, Lebanese. They're all kind of all together as Syrio-Lebanese communities. But this is the kind of differentiating point for the Palestinians. Yeah. And Nadim Bawalsa wrote a book on that very topic of this lobbying for citizenship by these Mahjari Palestinian communities from the British authorities in 1925. So in 1925, Palestine and the Palestinian identity was a topic of discussion and debate.
Yeah. I'm curious about just you brushed up against an idea that I actually realize I don't know the answer to, which is the terminology that they use. I'm for biographical reasons, I know that my great-grandparents on my mom's side who traveled to the U.S. from some of whom were from modern-day Lebanon, some of whom were from modern-day Syria, all describe themselves as Syrian. Mm-hmm. Is that also true for Palestinian? I know that in some places in Latin America, they're called like Turcos as well. How did they describe themselves, you think?
Yes, Turcos was a derogatory term that was applied to everybody that came from the Ottoman Empire, regardless of whether they're Syrian, Lebanese, or Palestinian. They didn't differentiate. It was just that type of derogatory term that's used as an umbrella term. The Lebanese and Syrian populations in the Mahjar in Latin America were obviously, these communities were much bigger than the Palestinian community. So often you would find these associations called Nadi House, and actually some of it was regional in terms of like where people came from, but you would always find Nadi House for some reason all over Latin America. So that would be the Syrian. Yeah, it was very prevalent. This is something I'd like to look into a bit more if I continue with this research. But there was all sorts of associations, some Syro-Lebanese, some just Lebanese, some by religious grouping, some by regional, like where people came from originally. They would get together and create Nadi this, Nadi that. The only difference is in Chile, because there was a big Palestinian community. They created a Club Palestino, and this was created very early on in the 20th century. Yeah. And the sporting club, which is now a famous football team, but there's also a country club called Club Palestino. That's the social aspect of this, but these are long-standing institutions. So in Chile in particular, you have a Palestinian club, but in the rest of the Mahjar, it was mainly Lebanese, Syrian associations, cultural centers, etc. There was a lot of them.
Okay, I want to move on to the second phase, which is literature under British occupation, 1900 to 1948. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the publications that you're looking at. Are they essentially the same publications as you go from phase to phase? Or they're new because of this new dynamic. There's something, a whole new set of publications.
I would say each phase has its own publications, mainly because Palestinian literary history is one of stunting, stopping, starting again, starting from scratch. After almost every phase, everything gets wiped out, as we are witnessing now. You wipe out the culture, the people, the history, and then people have to start from scratch. So the history is full of those kinds of moments. This moment, after the First World War and under British occupation, I mean, I also mentioned the late Ottoman period, but it was really to connect it to the Mahjar. So under British occupation, because most of the homeland, let's say, literary phases are always under occupation. And this is the point I wanted to make, that Palestinian literature never existed without occupation. So the Palestine portion of Palestinian literature was always under occupation for the purposes of this project, starting in the 20th century. With the late Ottoman and early British occupation. So that's important because there's always some sort of occupation. And that's why I wanted to call it the British occupation, even though it was a British mandate, it was British colonial rule, but just to have a continuity of these occupations. So during this period, I look at Palestinian newspapers and magazines, which more or less had to start from scratch after World War I, because of the war, because of censorship, because of devastation, because of all sorts of things that were taking place. So new magazines and newspapers start to sprout during this period. But again, even in this period, it's a history of censorship, silencing, revoking permits, not giving licenses. So you see some fleeting publications, ones that didn't live longer than 2-3 years. And in fact, this whole history of looking at these periodicals, because I argue that periodicals are the site of literary production and literary discussion. At the end of the day, like this, in this whole period, I think we're only talking about a few years of kind of ability to produce in a prolific manner. And even though Palestinians themselves were calling this some few years of this period a Nahda, a renaissance, in terms of Palestinian literary and cultural production, it was very short-lived. So in each period, I was always starting from scratch, as was the history and the reality at the time. So my sources kept changing.
So let's keep on going. I'm going to try to get through the timeline a little faster, just because this is such a huge project, and I want to get through as much as possible. So let's maybe talk about the next couple all at the same time. How did you think about the post-British occupation period? How did you make the decisions on how to split it up?
The period after the Nakba, I called it a period of triple occupations. So the kind of splitting in the land of historic Palestine into 3 parts, disconnected parts, under Jordanian rule, under Egyptian rule, and under Israeli occupation. So I put those all together because we're often dealing with a history of fragmentation. And although the fragmentation is a reality, I was trying to, as much as possible, bring things together, try to see continuities in the midst of discontinuities and ruptures. And I in that period, the conditions were similar, being under occupation, whether it was under Jordanian rule or Gaza under Egyptian rule, or the coastal areas and the Galilee and these areas of Palestine under Israeli rule. So this was, let's say, the homeland, and the diaspora was the post-1948 scattering, because this was a period where people just ended up in all sorts of places. And I tried really hard to trace people, those people that I came to know and met during the mandate period. It was not clear where they ended up. I had to research every single person and see what happened to this person, what happened to that person. Did they continue to write? Where did they live? Where did they work? Did they continue to publish? So it was a really difficult period to track in the diaspora. And under occupation, of course, there's just the difficulty in terms of what people were able to write and produce and publish during those periods.
That term, triple occupation, is so vivid, and so effectively describes sort of the violence and of that period. Is that a term that was used at the time?
Not really, and I hope I don't get too much criticism for it. I mean, I just, for the purposes of my project, in terms of understanding the conditions of production, this is the term that I found to be most helpful, because I was working with occupation and exile. So that's why I wanted to call it a triple occupation.
Yeah. Okay. I want to zoom in on one period in particular, and then use that as a way to jump into some of the figures that help sort of spurn you on and give you momentum, because they were just like a treasure trove. But let's talk about one period, which is 1967 to 1982. This is part of the literary diasporas, and you describe it as a golden age in exile. I'm going to read the little blurb, and then I have questions about it. After the June War of 1967, new waves of Palestinian refugees and exile joined the diaspora. Fragmentations and scattering were at their highest levels. This period nonetheless saw a brief moment of intensification of Palestinian literary and cultural production, as well as coming together of sorts, with Beirut at its center. Help paint a picture of what that period was like, 1967 to 1982. What were the main publications? Who were the main figures at the time? Who really defined that period?
So that period, I tried to cover quite a few geographies, literary geographies, at the center of which is, of course, Beirut. But I just want to mention that I look at the United States. Who was there? What were they doing? Or were they discussing? I look at Syria and Kuwait, which becomes extremely important in this history as a country, where some people ended up in Kuwait for various reasons before this period, but some people who could not go to Beirut went to Kuwait. So this was a kind of alternative to Kuwait because of the civil war and other factors. I also look at Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt, and then I come to Lebanon. So the interesting part about this history in Lebanon is that this is a moment of consolidation, of centralization, something that Palestinian literature and culture did not have all this entire time since 1948. So this, the kind of, even in the, let's say, territorialized history of Palestinian literature, which was before 1948, there was still an extra territorial element to it, etc. So that was always there. But here we have a consolidation in exile, what I called a nahda in exile. A nahda because it's a kind of renaissance, because of just how prolific this period was in terms of literary, cultural, and of course political production. And I don't really get into the politics of this period, because there was an amazing project that I think will be coming back online called the Palestinian Revolution, which was done by Kerman Abelsi and Abderrazak Takriti at the University of Oxford. And they covered a lot of the political aspects of this. But what was missing for me was what was cultural literary life like during this period, where you saw a flocking to Beirut, not just of Palestinians, but of all sorts of Arab writers, poets, artists who were fleeing persecution in their own countries or fleeing certain conditions in their own countries. And everybody found a kind of safe haven in Beirut at the time because of its openness, its inclusivity, which we know didn't last very long, but there was this moment which attracted a lot of people. And it attracted the Palestinian Revolution, which itself also attracted a lot of people. So the other fascinating aspect to this period is how open this identity is of being part of the Palestinian Revolution. And here you see a lot of Syrian, Iraqi, Maghribi writers, poets, etc., joining the Palestinian Revolution. And it's a moment of this kind of openness and inclusivity of a Palestinian identity not being a national identity or an ethnic identity as such, but being, an identity of resistance, of hope, of anti-colonial struggle, of all of these things that were at the forefront of the Third World Liberation movements, So this was really the kind of star at the time that people looked to see how do you struggle, how do you resist, how do you liberate. So this was a very interesting aspect. And here maybe I just mentioned that we did 2 interviews as part of, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, but with 2 non-Palestinians, Ilyas Khouri, who everybody knows, and Hadi Daniel, who is a Syrian poet who joined the Palestinian Revolution at 17 years old. And he followed the trajectory of, the PLO and the revolution as it left Beirut and went to Tunis. And in fact, he still lives in Tunis today. But he talks about this kind of open identity that people felt a belonging to rather than belonging to a nation or belonging to an ideology of sorts. So I just wanted to highlight this because this is a unique moment of openness and a coming together of all sorts of people, and not just, by the way, Arabs, but also from Japan, from Scandinavia, from Europe, etc. So this revolution attracted a lot of people. But I did want to highlight the non-Palestinians that were part and parcel of this. And that's why in my project, I also keep this inclusive, open frame that anybody who made a contribution to Palestinian literary cultural life is included in this project without judgment of like, are you Palestinian, are you not, etc.
Yeah. So I want to pick out some names from this period, the page on this period, and I would love to and I'm going to pick names I don't know.
Okay.
One of them that jumped out at me is Salma Khadra Jayussi, which is, you have an entire sort of amazing biographical spread, mapping out this woman's life from being born in 1925 in modern day Jordan to her death in 2023. Allah yarhamah, I should say.
Allah yarhamah.
Tell me about this woman and why, not necessarily why she's a part of the project, but about her contributions, and how you did your research. I mean, how you mapped out the entire life, as much as possible, as well as all the literary production in this amazing, completely connected graphic.
Salma Khadra Jayussi is one of the most important figures, I would say, in Palestinian literary history that is also almost always overlooked. She was recognized a lot more later in her life, but she was a tireless force in Palestinian literary history in the sense that she as a figure was of interest to me and the project because she's one of what I called connecting figures. So these are the figures that connect periods and literary geographies. And these are the figures that I often highlight in the text of each of the chapters of the periods. So that was the criteria for these kind of connecting figures. But Salma Khadra Jayussi was somebody also that we wanted to interview as part of these interviews because we wanted to focus on let's say, the elders of Palestinian literature. But unfortunately, her health didn't allow, and it was during COVID. But I did get to meet her. And her first comment to me was, "Why do you have a project on Palestinian literature?" And she's very, I met her and she was in her 90s, and she's a very sharp, very strongly worded kind of woman who like tells you off if she wants to tell you off. And she said, well, Palestinian literature is not different from Arabic literature. It's part and parcel of Arabic literature. It's got the same genres, styles, etc. And I, of course, agree. I mean, I can't disagree with Salma, but I said basically at the time that what is different is this kind of condition, the Palestinian condition of diaspora, exile, occupation, etc. That is makes it different. That we cannot study Palestinian literature in the same way we study other national literatures, which are centralized or territorialized, etc. But Salma, I mean, for me, was an inspiration before I met her because of her efforts to do this process of gathering. So she published an important anthology of modern Palestinian literature. And this was, for a long time, the only resource we had. But Salma went through a similar process that I went through. She had to gather material from people who were dispersed all over the world, whose publications were very difficult to access. You had to talk to people, dig in private, maybe archives or libraries, find out where they ended up, where do they live, who are their friends, trying to contact them. So in many ways, I feel like I'm just following in her footsteps in the publication of this important anthology, which I think took many, many years in the making, just to get to people and get the actual text of their contributions and translate them. And another thing she did was a big translation project to introduce the mainly American and English-speaking audiences to Palestinian and Arabic literature. This was a project called Prota. So she had these big, ambitious projects that I feel like I'm inspired by, and I carry on in these footsteps by these who I see as giants of Palestinian literature, Salma, Khadra, Jayussi being one of them.
Yeah, amazing. I'm curious about other places that were in flux. I mean, the whole region was in flux, but places like Iraq and Egypt. So characters like Jabra Ibrahim Jabra and Murid Barghouti. How intertwined are these figures? How much in conversation? I mean, they're not having Zoom calls, clearly. They're not texting on WhatsApp. How in step and in tune with each other's cultural production, literary production, philosophical, evolution, political thinking were these characters? I mean, like if I walked up to Jabra Ibrahim Jabra in 1971 and asked, what do you think about what Liana Badr is doing? Or what do you think about, Salwa, excuse me. Would Jabra have been like, oh yeah, I'm totally in step with them. Are they reading each other's work? Are they in tune? Are they connected? What is the nature of this transnational network?
Yeah, this is the key question. I think that was what I was trying to uncover if I could, but this is like a puzzle that has thousands and thousands of pieces just to understand. Was Jabra in conversation with, let's say Salma, because they're of the same generation? Did they know about each other's works, and how would they communicate? Or this was a key question because that was not clear in another national literature. I think you would know more or less, like these people met at this cafe or they all published in this journal, or, they attended these events, but it's not quite clear. You have to kind of see who their networks were, what were they involved in, where did they go, which conferences, which events, which institutions were they part of, did they travel? I know that Jabra traveled very frequently to Beirut in this period from Baghdad. So he's very much part of the Beirut scene. And I assume through that he might have met Salma, Khadra, Jayussi, maybe, but I couldn't, I needed to find evidence. So it was like detective work, trying to see. The other way to see was that to see, were they publishing in the same magazines, the same literary magazines? Where was Jabra contributing his articles? Where were others contributing their articles? Did they overlap? maybe they read the same issues. So the magazines become a connecting point because in many cases, like the Beirut magazines brought together a lot of writers from all over the Arab world, from the Maghreb to the Mashriq to wherever. So there were some central key periodicals in Beirut and in Cairo that would bring people together. And I assume everybody was reading those. But you don't really know unless you find evidence. So for Jabra, for example, Faisal Darraj in his interview talks about meeting Jabra for the first time at, if I remember correctly, a conference in Jordan. So they also met in these conferences, but if you don't have the kind of the archive of this conference, who attended, what did they discuss, who presented, etc., then it's hard to know who met who, when, or how. But Faisal Darraj talks about meeting Jabra Ibrahim Jabra and his kind of preconception of Jabra as this bourgeois-like man who is, arrogant, etc. But he's pleasantly surprised by actually the opposite. And Jabra then writes about his childhood growing up in utter poverty in Palestine. So that was kind of an interesting thing, but that we got only through interviewing somebody. So you have to kind of play the detective and try to find different clues and hints and look at different sources that might give you a kind of an evidence of who was in discussion with who, if they responded to each other's articles or reviewed each other's works. Or this is, for somebody doing this research now, these are the only methods I could come up with at the time, so I could trace these kinds of networks.
Yeah. I want to talk about people who surprised you, figures who you just really uncovered through this project. As somebody who's a professor of Arabic literature, are there figures or publications that blew your socks off? Like, I had no idea about these people.
So many, I can't tell you. I mean, this was the purpose of doing this work, because I was personally getting tired of everybody talking about only 5 people in Palestinian literature, as if there weren't hundreds of other names, but also to kind of expand the literary geographies and bring them together, but also go back in time before 1948. Because usually in Palestinian literature, we talk about Palestinian literature after 1948 and really after 1967. So there's a whole huge gap, which is most of the 20th century, that we don't talk about and we don't know much about. So I called these the black hole periods. And for me, this pre-1948 period, so the Mandate period, the Mahjar period, were black hole periods I knew nothing about. I did not even know a single name about the literary figures of those periods. And so a lot of people from that particular period were absolutely fascinating for me. So maybe I'll just mention some of them. One is Ishaq Musa al-Husseini, who I used some of his writings as a theoretical frame for thinking about this period, because he described Palestinian literature at the time as adab maqalat versus adab mu'allafat. So a literature of articles versus a literature of publications, which was the case at the time that most literary figures didn't publish books. They published their works in newspapers and magazines. And this kind of solidified the idea that magazines are absolutely essential to understanding literary life, debates, discussions. So Ishaq Musa al-Husseini, what was interesting about him is that he was a teacher. He was the teacher at this Arab college in Jerusalem, a famous independent school, an Arab nationalist school in Jerusalem. And he influenced the next generation of scholars. And I didn't know the connections between them. So I find out that Ishaq Musa al-Husseini was the teacher of Hanna Abu Hanna, who becomes another one of these giant figures. And really, he is one of those people like Salma, in whose footsteps I aspired to follow because of the amazing work he had done on Palestinian literature and literary heritage and uncovering this history of loss and trauma and destruction, etc. So it turns out that Ishaq Musa al-Husseini was Hanna Abu Hanna's teacher. And Ishaq Musa al-Husseini, before 1948, had written an article about Palestinian poetry. But what was interesting about this article was that it took Palestinian poetry across a period of 1,000 years. So he wasn't just saying like, we have Palestinian poetry because this was the topic of the debate, but we've had Palestinian poetry for 1,000 years. He goes back in time to people that I've never heard of. And so this comes up again inside Israel by Hanna Abu Hanna and Samih al-Qasim. They both write anthologies of Palestinian poetry that go back, taking this framework that Ishaq Musa al-Husseini had kind of influenced Hanna Abu Hanna with, and he takes it on. And they both, Samih al-Qasim was a well-known Palestinian poet, and Hanna Abu Hanna both write anthologies of Palestinian literature that use this framework, which I've never seen before or after these two publications. So these were really quite amazing for me to see that we're not just talking about Palestinian literature as a Palestinian identity of the 20th century or something. No, this was a longer history that people saw. It was a long, durée, like the long view of Palestinian literary history. And then there's two other figures during this pre-1948 period, during the Mandate and the British occupation, two actually Jordanians who lived in Jerusalem, West Jerusalem at the time. One was called Al-Badawi Al-Mulassam. And for me, I was like, Al-Badawi Al-Mulassam, who could this be? I mean, he like really, I really wanted to find out who was this Al-Badawi Al-Mulassam. This, I guess you would call him anyways, but it turns out that the first time I see an article by him and I see a picture, because they used to post also the photos of people, he looked like a proper intellectual, like glasses, wearing a suit, etc. And his name is Yaqub al-Udat, but wrote under this pseudonym of Al-Badawi Al-Mulassam. And he was a very important figure on the Palestinian literary scene before 1948 in Jerusalem. And he gets dispossessed, like all the other Palestinians who lived in West Jerusalem, and goes to Jordan. What was amazing about him is that after he goes to Jordan, after 1948, he begins to write a kind of encyclopedic work on Palestinian literary history, profiling each and every one of the figures. Now, the problem is that even though I'm a scholar of Palestinian literature, I have never come across this amazing, rich source that, it was written in Arabic. And I think this is why I wanted to prioritize and foreground and highlight Arabic sources when it comes to Palestinian literary history, because so much is neglected at the expense. These things are seen as inferior to the Western sources, right? But these are encyclopedic sources that I have never seen cited. I've never actually read. Nobody really talks about. So this is Al-Badawi Al-Mulassam, who really made a major contribution. Another thing that, I was blown away with this publication of his. Al-Badawi Al-Mulassam decides to go to Latin America and do a tour of all the Arab communities, the literary communities in Latin America. And he writes a 2-volume book, which is an absolutely amazing book. It's the most fascinating thing. It contains profiles of certain people, descriptions. It's part travelogue, part autobiography. It's a beautiful, beautiful resource. And I was really quite fascinated to start reading that source for this project. Another figure that travels to Latin America in 1947 to lobby against the partition of Palestine. And where does he go to lobby against the partition of Palestine, the vote at the UN General Assembly? He is Akram Zuaitar, and he gets sent by the Arab League to go to Latin America. He's not sent to go anywhere. And he spends like a year and a half in Latin America, going from country to country, documenting. He was a serial diarist. He wrote down absolutely everything, everyone he met, everything he did and saw, newspaper coverage, responses, etc. And he really documented this scene, this Arab scene in Latin America in such vivid ways and terms in this book called مهمة في قارة, a mission on a continent, or something like that, if I want to translate it. So there's some really amazing, mind-blowing Arabic language books that I came across from these early periods, plus others that I came across in later periods. But I just wanted to highlight these just because we often neglect these sources and overlook them because we prioritize Western language, Western sources.
Okay, I want to ask you just for as somebody who was born in Cyprus, I'm so curious about Cyprus as a hub for Palestinian literary production. Can you tell us a little bit about the publications that were coming out of Cyprus and some of the people who were writing there, and if in your analysis, if you were publishing in Cyprus, does it mean that you were also living in Cyprus?
Yes, good question. So Cyprus is important in two ways. One is that it was part of the way out of Palestine for Palestinians inside Israel. For example, when a number of Palestinians were deported by the Israeli authorities, mainly after 1967, they would go to Cyprus and then go somewhere else. Some of them also joined the Palestinian revolution in Beirut, but first they had to go to Cyprus. So there was always a Cyprus dimension there. People stayed there for brief periods or longer periods. Where Cyprus becomes very important in this project is in this post-Beirut period. Post-Beirut, so post-1982, the siege of Beirut and the exit or exodus from Lebanon of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and with it, the Palestinian Revolution, and with it, all whatever remained of any institutions or periodicals, or which were not very many. The PLO and its remaining political infrastructure moved to Tunis after 1982, after quite a few stops, but Tunis became the hub. But for cultural institutions, for periodicals, for publishing houses, Nicosia became the hub. I have not asked somebody to tell me exactly why it was Nicosia, but I can guess that it's closer to Beirut. It was easier to move the cultural, whatever remained of the cultural infrastructure to Cyprus versus Tunis, which was seen as quite far away and quite removed from the heart of the literary and cultural production. You know, Beirut being closer to Palestine and Cyprus also being closer to Palestine than Tunis.
Yeah.
And I guess for the political situation, they needed special permissions and a situation, whereas for cultural institutions, you would notice that actually a lot of the periodicals that moved to Cyprus, like Al-Karmel, which was Mahmoud Darwish's literary magazine, other Palestinian important magazines like Shu'un Filastiniya, etc., they are registered in Cyprus under a Cypriot name. So there's somebody who hosted, or some people who were willing to host these cultural institutions or periodicals and register them in Cyprus. This seemed to be easier than elsewhere. This is the impression I got. And that's why, and obviously being closer to Beirut, being closer to Palestine was important in case they, still had to go back and forth or do some stuff. But some people did move to Cyprus, to Nicosia, from the cultural figures did move to Cyprus, but some didn't. For example, Mahmoud Darwish, who is the person I highlight most during this period, because he actually covers all these important hubs at the time, which included Nicosia, Tunis, and Paris. So actually, Mahmoud Darwish himself lived between Tunis and Paris, but his publication, Al-Karmel magazine, was being published out of Nicosia. I mean, I don't know how they managed this, but it covered, all three of the hubs that I highlighted during this post-Beirut, post-1982 period. So while some people did live there and publish from there, some people ended up going to London afterwards and other places, so didn't live there for very long. But there's still, for example, Al-Rimal publishing house is still in Cyprus today. So
Yeah.
there's still some remnants of these institutions, but it was mainly the remains of the cultural scene that moved to Cyprus after 1982.
So like something like Kermel, how widely read was it, you think, globally? How important was it? I mean, right now, I feel like we can look back at it and say, oh, this Darwish's publication, and maybe inflate or deflate its importance. Help contextualize how important a publication like that was.
I would say it was the most important Palestinian and Arab magazine at the time. Not only that it was Mahmoud Darwish and he's Palestinian and that it was just dedicated to Palestinian literature. No, it did include Palestinian literature. It had special issues on Palestinian literature, but this was, as was the case at the time, these major Arab poets, each one of them had their own magazines. So Adonis had Mawaqif, Mohammed Banis had الثقافة الجديدة المغربية, and all of these major poets all had their own magazines. And Mahmoud Darwish was really one of the most established Arab poets on the scene. So his magazine, I would say, was pan-Arab, it was transnational, and it sat at the heart of the most important literary cultural debates in the Arab world as a whole. But for Palestinians, it was, I would say, the address for Palestinian literature, because there is no address, no physical, centralized, national address for Palestinian literature. I would say Al-Kermel played that important role, but it did engage in not just Arab intellectual debates and Palestinian issues, but also global intellectual, theoretical debates. It translated, for example, Edward Said. Edward Said was being translated and published in Al-Kermel, which I was a bit surprised to see, but I mean, it makes sense. French philosophers and intellectuals were also being translated. Mahmoud Darwish being in Paris opened up his horizons quite a lot, introduced him to many different networks and people in both the Maghreb, the Mashriq, and in Europe. So that opening up of Mahmoud Darwish's own horizons, also he became very, very prolific during this period, even though it's a period of decline for the Palestinian Revolution and the PLO. For Mahmoud Darwish, this was a hugely important period. So Al-Kermel also reflects that.
Yeah. Okay, before we end, I'm going to put you on the spot, and feel free to take a minute to think about this. But if you were just to give people 5 names to look up, you said at the very beginning that people often think there's only 5 names when they come to Palestinian literature and sort of literary figures. It's the same 5 names over and over again. So if I can give you the opportunity, give me 5 more names.
Okay. If you don't mind, I will mention names of women, because this was
I don't mind at all.
quite a challenge throughout the whole project to really identify the women involved in this literary history due to many reasons, including where they published and how they published, etc. So I will mention Samira Azzam. Some people are already paying attention to her, but she's an interesting figure who is coming up with her own concept of what she called adab al-ma'araka, battle literature, but it was really trying to understand what does it mean to write Palestinian literature after the Nakba, and how to universalize the Nakba. It's not something that just happens to Palestinians, but it's on a universal scale. It's important for humanity to understand, which is important for us to kind of think about now at this particular moment. So Samira Azzam, I would say Fadwa Tuqan. For me, she was an important connecting figure. She connected almost all the periods that I cover, because she was born during the British Mandate period. Of course, she's the sister of Ibrahim Tuqan, but she has a much, and he died young, unfortunately. But So she has a much longer history, spans multiple geographies and periods. And she was an important connecting figure. I would mention Najwa Qawar Farah. Again, a name I came across in the Mandate period. She was a bit difficult to trace after that, but because she moved a lot and she lived under different occupations, ended up in Beirut. And then I would also mention Asma Tubi. Again, a figure I did not know before. I came across her in the pre-1948 magazines, newspapers. And what's important about the women figures also during the Mandate period is that they were not just writers and they were writing for periodicals, etc., but they were also broadcasters, teachers. They worked at the radio. They had their own programming, etc. And another two women, Qudsiya Khurshid, who was also very much present on the scene before 1948, then immigrates to the United States, and Sadej Nassar, who was the wife of Najib Nassar, who published Al-Karmel newspaper in Haifa. And she was an editor, she was a contributor, she played a vital role in the history of this newspaper that's often overlooked. And in fact, if I am correct, she was the first woman to be imprisoned during the 1936 to 1939 Great Arab Revolt in Palestine.
I love it. But I said that was going to be my last question. I lied because I told myself I really wanted to ask you about prison literature as a almost like, I don't know if it's a theme or if it is a collection, but just tell me about this as a collection of, or why it was important for you to say, okay, this is something I want to take a look at intersectionally.
Prison literature is often studied as a separate genre. It was not clear how it connected to Palestinian literature and Palestinian literary history. And the more I started looking into it, the more I found that this history of prison, incarceration, arrest, administrative detention, I mean, this is a form of silencing, a form of oppression, torture, etc., was there throughout the history of Palestinian literature in the 20th century, directly impacting Palestinian literary figures in so many ways from the early 20th century, from when I looked at the British Mandate period until today. I mean, we know what's going on now. But this became important to find the points of connection between prison and Palestinian literature, because I would say, and maybe I need the statistics to back me up, that I would say there is an unprecedented number of Palestinian literary figures who were imprisoned. I don't know, I mean, I would say maybe 80%, which is a very high figure of, I don't know of any other literature where that many literary figures were imprisoned, administrative detention, forced exile or house arrest, or etc. And this is throughout. And people start to talk about it. So Khalil Baidas, from the early 20th century, starts to document his prison experience. And he has his own magazine called An-Nafa'is Al-Athriya, which stops for a period of 6 months because he's imprisoned. He's put on trial, a military style trial, like what happens now, and then writes about it. So this process of documenting prison experience and writing about it becomes central, and I would say integral, to Palestinian literature. And throughout these periods, I mean, it intensifies after the First Intifada and during the First Intifada, but this idea of as-sijn al-kabir, as-sijn al-saghir, the big prison, the small prison. This was there from the Mandate period until now. People say Gaza is one big prison, the big prison, the small prison. And this is something Emir Habibi wrote about the situation of Palestinians in Mandate Palestine, that they're all in one big prison and some others are in actual prison. So, and this continues. And I found a lot of iterations of this idea, we are all in a prison. But really, it's what was fascinating is finding these prison magazines and newspapers, which really brings to the fore this idea that has been written about in مجلة الدراسات الفلسطينية, that prison is the sixth geography of Palestine. After the 48 areas, Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza, the diaspora, and then prison. And Ilyas Khouri talks about it as Filastin tahta Filastin, Palestine under Palestine. And this is so, it's so essential to this history that it's prison is part and parcel of the Palestinian literary and cultural experience. It's very hard to disconnect them, especially that poets, writers, etc. wrote in prison, published in prison, published about prison, or were impacted personally and in terms of their literary output by their prison experience. It's just integral. And I really wanted to highlight it because we should bring those two things together, that it shouldn't just be studied as a separate genre.
Amazing. Well, the project is Country of Words. Please, I encourage you, if you listen to this on the podcast and you didn't watch it, please do yourself an enormous favor and check it out online, countryofwords.supdigital.org, and you can get lost in how rich of a resource it is. I'm honored that you came on, and thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me, Mikey.